Okay, let's dive into a world of, well, really stark contrasts. You picture this magnificent empire, right? Built literally on a lake, incredible engineering, floating gardens, huge markets, pyramids. I mean, it sounds amazing.
Stunning, yeah.
But then there's this other side. The side that's infamous and, frankly, really challenges us today. Widespread human sacrifice, even ritual cannibalism.
Confronting, definitely.
How do those two things even exist together? That's sort of the Aztec enigma we want to explore.
Right.
So today, we're going to unpack exactly that. We're doing a deep dive, looking at some source material excerpts from a script called Aztec Enigma, Blood, Ritual, and the Cosmos, and also digging into entries from Aztec's Wikipedia.
Yeah, and these give us a pretty rich picture covering everything from, the nuts and bolts of daily life and imperial structure.
Right.
All the way to these really deep cosmic beliefs that it seems were just completely intertwined with those rituals.
So where do we begin to understand this?
Well, I think we have to set the scene first. Ancient Mexico. It's crucial to remember the Aztecs, or more specifically, the Mexica people from Tenochtitlan who became dominant. They weren't the only sophisticated civilization there, not by a long shot.
Okay.
They were actually relative latecomers to the Valley of Mexico. They rose to power through this complex mix of alliances and, yes, conquest. They formed the heart of what's called the Triple Alliance, with Texcoco and Tlacopan.
So Aztec isn't just one simple label.
No, it's layered. Sometimes it means just the Mexica, sometimes that core Triple Alliance, and sometimes it's used, more broadly for related cultural groups.
Got it. And how do we know all this stuff?
It's a combination, really. Archaeology is huge. You think of the Templo Mayor finds, right, in Mexico City, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Then there are indigenous writings, codices, also the accounts from the Spanish conquistadors, which obviously you have to read critically. And crucially, these later colonial-era texts, like the Florentine Codex, that one's incredible because it recorded so much detail from indigenous people after the conquest.
Okay. So our goal here for you, the listener, is really to get past the maybe simplistic horror story version.
Right.
And gain a more nuanced understanding of this genuinely remarkable and, pretty challenging civilization. Let's see what these sources actually tell us.
Sounds good.
So maybe let's start right at the core, their worldview, because it seems like everything else kind of flows from that. The sources really emphasize that their beliefs were deeply connected to maintaining cosmic order.
Yeah, this is where it gets really fascinating and maybe where the enigma starts for us. Their creation stories, especially the Legend of the Suns, are absolutely central.
The Legend of the Suns.
Basically, they believe the universe had gone through previous eras, previous suns, that all ended in disaster, cataclysm.
Wow.
And this current era, the fifth sun, our world, it only came into being because the gods themselves made, immense sacrifices. They bled, they died. Some literally threw themselves into a sacrificial fire to get things going.
Gosh. So they saw the universe as fundamentally unstable, and their own existence was a direct result of gods dying.
Exactly. And sources suggest this created a kind of cosmic debt, a profound debt.
A debt owed by humans.
Yes. Humanity had the responsibility to repay the gods for that initial sacrifice. And the most precious payment, the most potent offering to keep the universe running, to stop it from collapsing again, was Chalchihuatl.
Chalchihuatl.
It means precious water. It refers to blood. And the essence within it, the life force, was called Tonali. That was the ultimate offering.
So it wasn't just random violence in their eyes. It was like a necessary transaction to keep everything going.
That seems to be the core idea, yeah. It was framed as cosmic reciprocity.
And the different gods had specific needs, right? Like Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god.
Right. He needed constant nourishment, that precious water, to fight off darkness each night and make sure the sun rose again. It was a daily battle.
And Tlaloc, the rain god.
Vital. He needed offerings for rain, for fertility. And sometimes, tragically, sources mention child sacrifices during severe droughts, seemingly to appease him or prevent floods.
That's hard to hear.
It is. And then you had Tezcatlipoca, god of the night sky, fate, destiny, a complex figure. And it's interesting, their whole pantheon wasn't static. They often incorporated the gods of people they conquered.
Flexible in a way.
Yeah, sort of absorbing them into their own system, which also, politically helped integrate conquered peoples. There's also mention of Ometeotl, a possible supreme dual god, male and female. Those scholars debate how central that concept was.
And this need for sacrifice, it wasn't just for big state events.
No, that's a key point from the sources. While the massive pyramid ceremonies are what we often picture, ritual, including Personal bloodletting, like piercing earlobes or tongues, seems to have been woven into everyday lives. It shows this constant, pervasive belief in needing to feed the gods and maintain that balance.
Okay, that gives us a much deeper sense of the why, even if it's difficult to grasp. Now, let's shift a bit. How did this empire actually work on a practical level? It was huge, complex.
It really was, and held together in some interesting ways. The basic unit, politically, was the altepetl.
Altepetl.
Yeah, it literally means water mountain. Think of
Oh.
it as a city-state. Each had its own ruler, the Tlatoani.
So lots of local rulers.
Exactly. And this points to the nature of the Aztec Empire, or the Triple Alliance, really. It wasn't mostly about territorial control like, say, Rome, planting flags and soldiers everywhere. It was more what we call a hegemonic confederacy. They'd conquer a place, but often they'd leave the local rulers in power or install new ones loyal to them.
Ah, so indirect rule.
Largely, yes. The main thing was ensuring those conquered altepetl paid tribute. Taxes, goods, labor that flowed back to the core, to Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. That tribute system was absolutely crucial.
And the society itself within that structure, distinct classes.
Oh, definitely. The sources talk about the Pippleton, that's the hereditary nobility, maybe 5% or so of the population. They had loads of privileges, special clothing, could own land privately, held the top jobs in government, military, priesthood.
Okay, the elite. And below them.
The Maswalton,
Yeah.
the commoners, originally mostly farmers. But as cities grew, this group included artisans, merchants, low-level priests, warriors.
Did commoners move up?
Yes, that's really interesting. The sources suggest it wasn't a totally rigid system. The main way Maswali could gain status, maybe even some privileges usually reserved for nobles, was through military success. Specifically, capturing enemy warriors for sacrifice.
Ah, so capturing enemies was a path to social mobility.
It seems so, yeah. There was also slavery, tlacotin, but the sources indicate it wasn't usually hereditary. Slaves had certain rights, could own property, even buy their freedom. It wasn't chattel slavery like in some other parts of the world.
What about gender roles?
The sources describe them as distinct, but also complementary, and importantly, often see as equally valuable.
Equally valuable. How so?
Well, typically men were associated with the outside farming, war, long-distance trade. Women were central to the inside the household, weaving textiles, which were super important economically and ritually, raising children. But women weren't just stuck at home. They were market vendors, doctors, priestesses, midwives.
So active in the economy and religion, too.
Definitely. And legally, women could own property. Property inheritance was bilateral, meaning through both male and female lines. Some sources even use metaphors comparing childbirth and domestic work to warfare, suggesting both were seen as vital contributions to the state and the cosmos.
Fascinating. And underpinning all this society was their agriculture, right? You mentioned maize.
Maize was king, yes. But the real genius, especially around Lake Texcoco, was the chinampas.
Ah, the floating gardens. Though they didn't really float, did they?
No, not exactly. They were artificial islands built up from the shallow lake bed. Muck, vegetation, mud layered to create these incredibly fertile rectangular plots separated by canals.
And these were super productive.
Amazingly so. You could get multiple harvests a year. Sources suggest just 1 hectare could potentially feed up to 20 people. And there were thousands of these around Tenochtitlan. It was intensive, sustainable agriculture that fueled the huge population.
Wow. And that food surplus allowed for other things.
Absolutely. Specialized crafts flourished. Weaving, as I mentioned, was huge. Ceramics, incredible featherwork, working gold and precious stones, making obsidian tools.
And all this stuff was traded.
Oh, yeah. The markets were legendary. Smaller towns might have a market every week or so, but the big cities, especially Tlatelolco right next to Tenochtitlan, had massive daily markets. Cortés himself was stunned by the size and orderliness. He wrote about maybe 60,000 people there daily.
60,000 daily.
That's what he claimed. And these markets had judges, supervisors, making sure things were fair.
So organized.
Very. And then you had the Poteca. These were specialist long-distance merchants. They traveled far beyond the empire's borders, bringing back luxury goods like jade, cacao, exotic feathers. But they weren't just traders.
Yeah, what else?
They often acted as spies for the emperor, gathering intelligence. They even had their own guilds, their own gods, their own courts. A really unique group.
And how did people pay for things? Barter.
Some barter, sure. But they also used currency. For small stuff, cacao beans were common, like, a certain number of beans for a tomato or a turkey. For bigger purchases, they used standardized lengths of cotton cloth called quachtli.
Okay, cloth as currency. And don't forget the tribute flowing in.
Crucial. That tribute: maize, beans, textiles, pottery, warrior costumes, feathers, everything imaginable, depending on what the conquered region produced, was constantly flowing into the capital cities and redistributed. It was a massive part of the economy.
And the capital itself, Tenochtitlan, built on a lake. Just picture that.
It must have been breathtaking. Sources describe this very planned, symmetrical layout. Canals used like streets, canoes everywhere, and at the center, this huge sacred precinct, walled off, containing dozens of temples and pyramids.
Dominated by the Templo Mayor.
Exactly, the Great Temple. Twin pyramids on top, one for Huitzilopochtli, one for Tlaloc. Just imagine the scale. Population estimates are tricky, but we're talking potentially hundreds of thousands in Tenochtitlan itself, maybe over 1 million in the whole basin. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time.
Incredible. And other big cities, too.
Oh, yeah. Texcoco was a major center of learning and culture. Cholula, further out, was famous for its massive pyramid, actually the largest pyramid by volume in the Americas.
It's just amazing to think about that vibrant, complex world, and then we have to bring it back to the rituals, the part that's so hard for us.
Yeah. This is where the sources get, well, graphic and describe the practices we find so disturbing.
Well, like the sacrifices on the pyramids.
That's the most famous type, especially the heart extraction at the Templo Mayor. The sources describe victims being led up the steps, priests performing the extraction. It was a very public, very potent ceremony. And nearby, often, were the Tzompantli.
The skull racks.
Yeah. Rows and rows of skulls displayed publicly. A stark warning, maybe, but also seen as a testament to the gods' favor, proof that the sacrifices were being made.
Were there other kinds of sacrifice?
Yes, the sources mention several. There was a kind of gladiator sacrifice, where a captive warrior, maybe tied to a stone, had to fight several fully armed Aztec warriors. There was arrow sacrifice, victims being burned, drowned, and as we mentioned, sometimes child sacrifice to Tlaloc.
Just awful. Where did all these victims come from?
Primarily, the sources say they were captured enemy warriors. This ties into the idea of the Flower Wars, Xochiatl.
Flower Wars.
These seem to have been ritualized conflicts, perhaps specifically arranged between certain city-states, partly for training warriors, but significantly also for capturing victims for sacrifice. It wasn't necessarily about conquering territory in these specific wars.
So war specifically to get captives.
And that seems to have been a major function, yes. Slaves were also sacrificed. And interestingly, sources suggest sometimes Aztecs themselves volunteered.
Volunteered for sacrifice.
Sounds incredible to us,
yeah.
But yeah, seeing it as a great honor, a way to directly join the gods, maybe ensure a good afterlife for themselves or their families, a direct contribution to that cosmic balance they believed in.
Wow. Okay. And then there's the ritual cannibalism aspect.
Right. We have to address that. The sources do indicate that in some rituals, parts of the sacrifice victim, usually a captive warrior, were prepared and consumed, often by the captor and his family.
Why? That's been debated a lot, hasn't it?
Hugely debated. There was an older theory put forward by anthropologists like Michael Harner and Marvin Harris that it was basically about protein deficiency, that the Aztecs needed meat, and this was a way to get it.
But that's not widely accepted now.
No, it's been pretty effectively challenged. Scholars like Bernard Ortiz Montellano pointed out the Aztecs had a rich diet: maize, beans, squash, amaranth, plus turkeys, dogs, deer, fish, insects. Plenty of protein, especially for the elites who were most involved. Plus, the sacrifices often happened when food was abundant, not scarce.
So if not nutrition, then what?
The consensus now, based on the sources, leans heavily towards ideological and political reasons.
Ideological, like absorbing the enemy's strength.
Possibly something like that, yeah. A way of incorporating the tonali, the life force, of a brave warrior. But also political.
How so? Political.
Think about the impact. This wasn't just about feeding gods. It was a powerful tool for social control. Imagine being a representative from a conquered province, forced to witness these mass sacrifices in Tenochtitlan.
Terrible.
Exactly. It instilled fear. It was a brutal deterrent against rebellion, crucial for an empire that ruled indirectly through tribute. It was also a massive public spectacle, reinforcing the power of the ruler, the priests, their connection to the gods who demanded this. It showed everyone who was in charge.
Displaying power through ritual terror.
That seems to be a big part of it, yeah. And all these ceremonies, these festivals, were meticulously timed according to their complex calendar system.
The two calendars, right?
Yeah, intertwined. A 260-day sacred count, the Tonal Pawali, and a 365-day solar year, the Iowali. Together they created a 52-year cycle, kind of like our century. Each period had specific rituals and festivals associated with it. It structured their entire ritual life.
Such a complex system. And then everything changes. The Spanish arrive 1519.
Yeah, Hernán Cortés lands. And he was, well, incredibly politically astute, or maybe just lucky and ruthless.
What do you mean?
He immediately picked up on the resentment many other groups felt towards the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalteca, for instance, had been fighting the Aztecs for generations. Cortés made alliances with them, and others. That was absolutely key. Without those indigenous allies, the Spanish conquest likely wouldn't have happened the way it did.
So he used internal divisions.
Masterfully. He marches to Tenochtitlan, meets the emperor, Moctezuma II. At first, things are tense but sort of functional. Moctezuma lets them into the city.
A fatal mistake.
In hindsight, absolutely. Relations break down. There's a famous incident where the Spanish, maybe feeling threatened while Cortés was away, massacre a large number of Aztec nobles during a religious festival in the Great Temple Precinct.
Oh, wow.
That sparks a massive uprising. The Aztecs drive the Spanish out of the city in what the Spanish called La Noche Triste, the sad night. Moctezuma dies during this chaos. The sources are unclear. Was he killed by the Spanish or by his own people who felt he'd been too accommodating? We don't know for sure.
So the Aztecs won that battle.
That one, yes. But Moctezuma's successor, Huitzilopochtli, rules only briefly. He likely dies of smallpox.
Ah, disease. That was huge, wasn't it?
Devastating. Smallpox, measles. European diseases the indigenous population had zero immunity to. It swept through Tenochtitlan and the surrounding areas even before the final siege, killing potentially a third or even half the population. It weakened them catastrophically.
So weakened by disease, facing Spanish technology and tactics, and crucially, those indigenous allies.
Exactly. The final Aztec ruler, Cuauhtémoc, a young, brave leader, leads the defense of Tenochtitlan during a brutal siege by Cortés and his allies that lasted months. Starvation, disease, constant fighting.
Horrific.
Eventually, Tenochtitlan falls in August 1521. Cuauhtémoc is captured.
And he was tortured. There's that famous story.
The story is that Cortés tortured him, binding his feet over coals, trying to get him to reveal where Aztec gold was hidden. It's a powerful image, often depicted, but it's important to note that contemporary indigenous accounts don't seem to mention that specific detail. What is known is that Cortés kept him prisoner for a few years, then had him executed in 1525, fearing he might incite rebellion. That was really the definitive end of the independent Aztec Empire.
And after the fall, what happened next?
The Spanish set up their own rule, New Spain, but interestingly, they often used the existing structures. The old altepetl became the basis for Spanish administrative units, often still run by local indigenous nobles who collaborated with the Spanish.
So some continuity, in a way.
Some, yes, but overlaid with Spanish control, the forced labor system of the encomienda, and the systematic suppression of Aztec religion. Temples were destroyed, idols smashed, priests killed or driven underground.
Yeah.
Their whole educational system was dismantled.
And the population decline continued.
Catastrophically, mostly due to repeated waves of disease throughout the 16th century. Estimates vary, but it's possible the indigenous population of central Mexico dropped by as much as 90%. 90%.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost unimaginable.
Just staggering. Did any of the old Aztec elite survive?
Some did, yes.
Yeah.
Colonial sources show the descendants of Moctezuma II, for example, and other high-ranking nobles, were often granted titles and lands by the Spanish crown. They integrated into the colonial aristocracy, maintaining wealth and status, though obviously within a completely new power structure.
But despite all that destruction, the suppression, the population collapse, the Aztec legacy didn't just vanish, did it? It seems incredibly present in Mexico today.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere once you start looking. Obviously, the archaeological sites, the Templo Mayor, literally next to the main cathedral in Mexico City, is the prime example. Museums are full of breathtaking Aztec art and artifacts.
And language.
Yeah. Many Nahuatl words in the language of the Aztecs are part of everyday Mexican Spanish. Words like chocolate, tomato, avocado, those come directly from Nahuatl.
And symbols too, right? The Mexican flag.
Exactly. The central image on the Mexican flag, the eagle, perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent that comes directly from the Aztec foundation myth for Tenochtitlan. It's a powerful symbol of national identity. You see Aztec imagery in place names, metro station logos in Mexico City. It's deeply woven into the cultural fabric.
How did that happen after the Spanish tried so hard to erase it?
Well, perceptions changed over time. After Mexican independence in the 19th century, there was a shift. Instead of seeing the Aztecs purely as barbarians, as the Spanish had portrayed them, they began to be re-evaluated, even romanticized, as a source of unique national heritage, distinct from Spain.
Like reclaiming the indigenous past.
Exactly. Movements like Indigenismo championed this. Figures like Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor who resisted the Spanish, became national heroes. You see this reflected powerfully in 20th century art, especially the murals of Diego Rivera, which often depict Aztec life and history in a very proud, central way.
And it's not just in Mexico, right? There's always been this international fascination.
For centuries, starting way back with European scholars like Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century, then historians like William Prescott, whose History of the Conquest became a bestseller. That fascination continues today. Academic study, popular books, movies.
Yeah.
The Aztecs still capture the imagination.
So it's been quite a journey we've taken here, from trying to understand that deep cosmic necessity, the belief that blood sacrifice was needed to keep the universe going, through the sheer sophistication of their city, their society, their art, and then the brutality of the conquest and this really powerful, enduring legacy. It's a civilization that just forces you to confront these profound contrasts.
It really does. And I think the ultimate challenge for us, looking back through these sources, is trying to genuinely grapple with that worldview. How do we understand a perspective where death and sacrifice weren't necessarily seen as just horror, as we instinctively see it, but as, well, as fuel, as part of a vital, sacred duty to maintain cosmic order in what they believed was a very fragile universe?
Yeah, it's difficult to wrap your head around.
Understanding the context doesn't mean condoning the violence, obviously, but it reveals a people operating under this intense, perceived cosmic responsibility.
It really leaves you thinking, and maybe that's the final thought to ponder from all this, something right from their core belief system. The idea that death wasn't the end of creation, but somehow instrumental in keeping it going. What does it truly mean for a culture to believe that life itself depends on death? That's something that definitely stays with you.